Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it is time for some PathOfExile discussion. Patch 3.20 is still a few weeks away, but today GGG published the first of the balanced manifestos for it. And just a reminder that they're having 4 balanced manifestos with the potential for a 5th one, and that these are all going to come out sometime in advance of the live stream and the patch notes. So this is going to give a bit of a flavour as to some of the major changes that are happening in the patch. That said, we'll say that this one is reasonably minor. The big winners from this balanced manifesto are people who don't get to super late endgame. So it's players that don't necessarily pick up a Watcher's Eye and a Forbidden Flame and Forbidden Flesh jewel, and all of the other really top-end endgame unique jewels, but end up stopping their progression a little bit short of that. Those players are going to get a whole lot of new toys in the form of new ways to mitigate elemental ailments. The definite losers from this are people who are playing top-end stat stacker builds. So if you do hear someone saying that this is a pure nerf manifesto, do check if they're the sort of player that sinks 20 mirrors into a stat stacker build each league, as that just may have influenced their opinion a little bit. So what can we expect here? GGG start out the manifesto by saying that currently there are modifiers, I think a lot of players may not even realise these exist, that provide ailment mitigation effects on jewels. Some of these are corruption only, for example, 20 to 25% chance to avoid being ignited. This is a Vaal implicit on various jewels. And some of them are rolled mods, like of insulation, 15% reduced effect of chill and shock on you. GGG's attitude is that these are too weak at the moment. So what they're going to do is increase both the number of these mods that exist and their power. By increasing the number, they will be making it slightly harder to roll certain combinations of mods on jewels, although I think that that's being overstated a lot because jewels have been made much easier to roll in the last patch. 3.19 introduced a lot of extra sources of fractured jewels as random drops from monsters and especially from Arch Nemesis monsters, and those are an extremely powerful crafting tool. Not necessarily every fractured jewel that drops, but the ones that have a good locked mod on them. Those in conjunction with the fairly recently added critical strike fossils have made it so that it is much easier than at any point earlier in the game's history to roll jewels that you're after. So with that in mind, I think that the concerns that some people are raising about this diluting the mod pool on jewels, yes, this will make applying Chaos Orbs to jewels worse. Yes, this will make it harder to roll a Critical Strike Multiplier jewel that's all Critical Strike Multiplier rolls on it, but not by very much, because the way people do that is by starting with a jewel that has one of those mods fractured onto it, and then applying crit fossils to it. And in that situation, these new mods are not going to have very much weighting because it's not going to be amped up because it's not critical tagged. Rolling most popular top-end jewels will be easier in 3.20 than it was in 3.18 or any league before that, although it will be slightly harder than it was in 3.19, which was the easiest league ever for rolling high-end jewels. It's worth noting that classic jewels, i.e. the Crimson Jewel, Cobalt Jewel, and Viridian Jewel, are getting reduced duration and reduced effect for specific ailments, and Abyss jewels are getting avoidance mods instead. And something I realised I needed to add during editing here, the caps on these are going to be 35% for the reduced effective ailments on classic jewels and 50% for the avoidance on Abyss jewels. I'm expecting, and we don't have confirmation on this yet, that there will be 1 tier on classic jewels and there will be 4 tiers on Abyss jewels, but that is still subject to further confirmation down the line from GGG. One thing I'm reading between the lines here is that some of the corrupted jewel implicits might be being changed here. I don't see anything to suggest that corrupting blood immunity is being removed, but if that mod was to go legacy, that would be a huge change to the current game. I don't really expect it because I feel like it's the sort of thing that would have been called out here if it was happening. A GGG summary of this section is that jewels should be a more reliable and less expensive source of ailment mitigation through their higher mod values and better variety of mods. I think this is right. I think that this is generally right. So one question that's getting asked a lot online is this going to be a significant nerf to your chances of rolling jewels that you desire? So let's say that you want a quadruple critical strike multiplier jewel. The way that you would actually get that in the game at the moment is by trading firstly for a jewel that already has one relevant critical strike multiplier mod locked onto it as a fractured mod. And after that, you're going to roll the rest of the way with fossils. You will definitely be using death fossils. You might be using prismatic fossils depending on what your goal is. Whatever the case, the individual critical strike multiplier mods are going to be the lion's share of the overall weighting of the mod pool, and the ailment mods, even if they are amped up by a prismatic fossil, shouldn't be a particularly meaningful overall change. Ultimately, I expect that rolling a quad crit multi-jewel will be easier in 3.20 than it was in 3.18 or earlier, but it will be harder than it was in 3.19. 3.19 was a golden age for crafting them, and that was because of Arch Nemesis just dropping more of those fractured bases to get them started. The second section relates to unique jewels, and this is not something I was expecting at all. Most unique jewels are not very exciting to find. There's a few reasons for this. In most cases, they are simply underpowered or apply to a too narrow window of usage or both. There are also many corruption-only jewels that don't fulfill a good purpose. Previously, we were hesitant to revisit unique jewels and improve them beyond their initial designs because many of their themes are somewhat rigid in nature, meaning there is little room to improve them without completely remaking them. An example of this is the Fireborn Crimson Jewel. It has no values that we could increase in order to make it more useful. Now, I don't actually agree here. I think that they could say increases and reductions to other damage types in radius are transformed to apply to fire damage at 110 to 125% of their current value, and that would make the jewel better than it is now. That is something that could be done to make it better. Whether that's good enough to use, I'm not sure. I'd have to really seriously theorycraft with it, but it is something that they could do a little bit of a tweak in order to make it better. And then they go on to say something, any improvements we could make to this jewel would have to fundamentally change its identity and would therefore essentially remove the jewel in its current form from PathOfExile. Yeah, as I say, I think you could make it to be at a percentage of value. That's a bad example, but there are some other jewels that practically have no purpose currently. GGG's change here, though, is really interesting. We're making it so that every unique jewel it drops is very rare and highly desirable. This means that many existing unique jewels have been removed from the drop pool. Now, they're not necessarily removed from the game. We'll come back to those in a sec. The intention now is that when you find a unique jewel, it should almost always be a very positive experience. To help make jewel drops special, we've designed a set of unique jewels that are powerful chase items. These can drop from the core pool, and you can learn more about these in our upcoming announcement livestream for the 3.20 expansion. Now, when they say powerful chase items, I am broadly expecting this means that they will be Mageblood / Headhunter rarity, although, of course, that could be wrong. With that said, there were some unique jewels that were still useful for a subset of players because they had build-enabling modifiers or other very niche uses, like the attribute transformation jewels, Fertile Mind, Brute Force Solution, and the like. Instead of getting rid of these, we've made them corruption-only unique jewels. This one really surprised me when I was reading this. We feel this has benefits for both players who want them and players who don't, as generally players who don't want them won't come across them as core drops, and players who do want them can actively pursue them. Now, while it is true in theory that this is going to make them better for players that don't want them in the sense that you're never going to see them, and potentially better for players that want them in that this is a way to deterministically chase these items, it also has a couple of drawbacks. So firstly, the Brute Force Solution / Fertile Mind attribute transforming jewels, these are in an awkward spot where they have a fairly wide Divine Orb range on them, and actually, because of Leadership's price existing, players often want a very specific value. So for example, you can have a build that wants exactly plus 21, that can't use plus 16, can't use plus 24, it wants exactly plus 21 dexterity on one of these jewels. That's something that I think is going to be considerably harder to get in this world, because those jewels are not very rare, so you can use the 3-for-1 vendor recipe on them, and there's a whole bunch of other ways you can chase them, like the Divination card that comes out of Heist Jewelry chests, all sorts of things like that that you can do in order to chase down the attribute transforming jewel with the mod you care about. The other thing is that for those builds at top-end investment, you can often go for 1 or 2 Vaal corruptions on those jewels, and that's not going to be an option here because you're simply not going to be able to get Vaal corruption on them. So I think that this is a considerable nerf to the attribute transformation jewels in general. I wouldn't mind seeing a slight rework where those jewels get a higher amount of whatever attribute they're giving. So if instead of 16 to 24, it was instead 32 to 40 of that attribute, and then have them be corruption only as is said here. It's certainly the case that we're not going to be able to Vaal heaps of these chasing corrupting blood immunity in the future, because that was something that I definitely did. I was always happy to pick up a Fertile Mind early in a league, and if I got, say, a 23 on it, I'll just Vaal it. If it rolled corrupting blood immunity, fantastic, sell it for 2 divines. If it didn't roll corrupting blood immunity, meh, just stick it in a 10C tab and forget it exists. Some build-enabling unique jewels can now be found from more deterministic sources throughout PathOfExile. One example is Combat Focus, which now comes from a vendor recipe. This is one of those things that I think SSF players will like, and non-SSF players will largely not notice. Some build-enabling jewels that affect golems can no longer drop, but can be found from another, more deterministic source. While I want you to discover this new source on your own during gameplay, we will say for clarity's sake that these do not come from vendor recipes. Now, one of the things that came to mind when I was reading through this section is that this makes Ancient Orbs on jewels potentially very, very good. We'll have to see exactly how that lines up in the end, but for now, I think that using Ancient Orbs on belts may no longer be the thing, and it may well be that you're going to use them on jewels. These Ancient Orbs would be hoping both to get the chase jewels, and also to try and get things like Unnatural Instinct from the current core drop pool, or Intuitive Leap, or any of the other items that remain in the game that are still pretty good. This winnowing out of bad uniques objectively makes Ancient Orbs much better than they've been, and maybe that's going to be the identity for Harbinger content going forward. Maybe GGG will engineer a situation where the loss of Exalted Shards is made up for by new demand for Ancient Shards. We'll see on that. So the summary here, our goal is that finding a unique jewel is an exciting experience. Unique jewels that drop naturally should be those that are very valuable with broad appeal to the average player, either to use in your own build or trade to someone else. We've worked towards this goal by removing boring unique jewels, adding more chase unique jewels, and moving jewels that do appeal to a smaller subset of players to other places so they can be pursued by choice. Now, I think that if they get this perfectly right, then this is going to be a good thing. I don't think they're going to get it perfectly right. I reckon there's going to be 1 or 2 or 3 examples of items like Frostferno that have genuine use cases that get removed as a result of this change. And I would urge GGG to be very careful to make sure that where there is a niche use case for a jewel, that you still make it available through a vendor recipe somehow, and also don't obfuscate these vendor recipes. Make them something that's pretty easy to figure out. If it's a jewel that explicitly calls out a skill, then just make it a level 20 gem of that skill plus a Blessed Orb. Something along those lines that's pretty simple to figure out. The next section looks at the unique jewels. Now this one's really interesting because I kind of think that GGG's statement of the problem here is a little bit wrong. Now this is going to make Ward Loop players very upset. So let's go through this. Many of the unique jewels that are currently granted through quest rewards are not very desirable. Additionally, because they're offered to all players who make their way through the campaign, they're extremely common, which inhibits them from having value or being meaningful items to find. We've also come to feel that it's thematically incorrect to offer unique items as quest rewards, as it undermines their feeling of uniqueness and prestige. Solution: unique jewels will no longer be offered as quest rewards. Most of the jewels that were previously offered have been removed entirely, though some important ones have had their effects preserved in the form of new unique items, or by being added to the pool of rollable jewel modifiers. Now, the one that I'm thinking of here is Survival Secrets. This has flasks applied to you have 20% reduced effect. This is a mod you cannot get anywhere else. It is objectively bad on most builds, but in the case of Ward Loop builds, this is an extremely strong mod. Not an extremely bad mod like it sounds. This actually makes the build objectively a lot better. So whilst this is not an item that is of general use, this very much has a powerful niche use. Now, the other one of these jewels that's important is Conqueror's Efficiency, but because it has a replica, I wouldn't be surprised if it gets moved into the core drop pool. We'll have to see exactly what they do with that. These quest rewards now offer a random rare jewel. Because the rewards are not static like the unique jewels were, they may have a better chance of being useful to the receiver, or something that may be valuable in trade to others. At the very least, they should be less predictable. I think really it just comes down to less predictable. A random rare jewel is not much of a reward. I do think GGG could consider giving 3 that are already identified that players can choose between. I think that would be a better choice than just giving us 1 that you have no agency over, because really, a rare jewel on the ground is not some impressive reward, and this is just going to be identical to a rare jewel on the ground. Summary: players should no longer be burdened with predictable unique jewel quest rewards. I don't think most people will see it that way, but will not entirely miss out on some of the valuable aspects they did have. I do think it's fine to set a tone that unique items are not something that comes up deterministically throughout the campaign, but this is something I do think is, broadly speaking, the part of the manifesto that is slightly on the nerfy end. Whilst the first section on ailment avoidance is a moderate buff to a lot of players, this section is going to be a small nerf overall. In conclusion, jewels should be more exciting than before and provide a better source of ailment mitigation than they were in 3.19. Jewels with effects that were useful only to a subset of players should still be attainable while moving them out of the way of players who aren't interested in them. You can find out more information in the patch notes and the announcement livestream. I think this set of changes will sink or swim depending on whether GGG get the removal aspects right. If they remove only jewels that people genuinely don't care about, then this is going to be a popular set of changes over the long term. On the flip side, if they remove various jewels that have some genuine use cases, then that's going to just end up annoying people. I'm not necessarily talking about things that are ultra extreme niche items like combustibles, which is a crimson jewel that is primarily used by people who are looking to do magic find testing and looking to see what happens when they stack 100% reduced quantity of items found on one character. That's really its only use case, is for testing that edge case. These sorts of things can go, but there'll be things that have genuine uses that will probably get removed. And I think that GGG really need to be very careful on that. It is better to leave a couple of disappointing things in the game. Put it this way, if you don't think many people will use it, but you think some people will, just put it into tier 1 rarity. In that situation, if you're right and no one wants it, it just ends up as a 10 chaos unique that people sometimes get, have a little bit of a laugh, oh gee, I haven't seen that in ages, the kind of way that you do if you pick up a Gruthkul's Pelt. On the flip side, if it has a use you didn't anticipate, and that use ends up being really good, then you've just made the next chase unique item. Either way, ends up being pretty good. So that's my advice there. Throw those things that you think no one's going to want, throw them into tier 1 rarity. They won't come up very often. When they do, it'll be either a little bit of a laugh or it'll be an oh wow moment. That's all I've got. May your Vaal orbs have interesting results.